Our third panel today, so on Ismaili Doctrines and Literature, part 1. And before we start, just a short note that we had to change the order of the panel a little bit, because our first speaker, Professor Hermann Landolt, unfortunately is not here today, but he sent us his paper. So Dr. Daryoush Mohammad Poor will read his paper. And we don't have Dr. Jalal Badakhshani is not here as well, so his paper will be replaced by the paper of Dr. Sultonbek Aksakolov. So the order, we will start with we will start from the end actually with Professor Tahera Qutbuddin's paper. Professor Tahera Qutbuddin from University of Chicago, and the title of her paper is Principles of Fatimid Ta'wil in the Majālis Mu'ayyadiyya of al-Mu'ayyad fi al-Dīn al-Shīrāzī. Majālis Mu'ayyadiyya, sorry. Please, Tahera.
Thank you. Greetings, everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And I want to begin by thanking the Institute of Ismaili Studies and the conference organizers, Daryoush Mohammad Poor, also Julia Kolb and Naushin Premji for the logistical help. All right, so I was invited to present a summary of my recently published article on Principles of Fatimid Ta'wil. I'll highlight salient aspects of these principles, and I've argued in the article that together they comprise a systematic hermeneutic of Fatimid symbolic interpretation. Can you all hear me? Great. Now, through the centuries, Muslims have sought to understand the true meaning of the Qur'an and Sharia. They've grappled with some of the Qur'an's apparent contradictions. For example, which verse should be taken at face value? The one that states fresh faces will look at God on the last day, or the one that states eyes cannot see him, la tudrikuhu al-absar? Muslims have also tried to make sense of the seemingly arbitrary nature of the Sharia. Why pray 2 cycles in the dawn prayer, for example, and 3 in the Maghrib prayer? Why fast in the month of Ramadan and not, say, Safar? The Fatimid hermeneutic answered these questions by harmonizing revelation and reason through the divinely guided exposition of the living Imam from the line of Muhammad and Ali. Now, when the Fatimids came on the scene, 3 major systems of Quranic hermeneutic had developed. The Sunni majority, influenced by Ash'arite theology, believed scripture was literally true. God possesses a hand, they said, but without asking how, bila kaif. The Mu'tazilites averred that scripture was figuratively true, to be interpreted in a way that was compatible with human reason. They construed God's hand, for example, as his power. The philosophers used cosmology to explain the nature of the universe, and they denied key propositions of the Qur'an, such as bodily resurrection. The Fatimids, while endorsing some of their competitors' techniques, rejected all 3 conceptualizations and delineated their own. They asserted that faith is rational and that this rationality is accessed only through its inner meaning, ta'wil. Ta'wil, the Fatimids maintained, conveys the true meaning of the Qur'an and Sharia. Now, no Fatimid text enumerates their hermeneutic principles. These must be inferred. Several Fatimid da'is expounded ta'wil, including Al-Qadir Nu'man, Hamiduddin Kirmani, and others. Within the genre, the Majālis Mu'ayyadiyya of their successor, the preeminent Fatimid scholar and chief da'i al-Mu'ayyad fi al-Dīn, al-Shīrāzī, is the culmination of Ta'wil's schematics. Its remarks on interpretive principles, together with rich and varied applications, make it an ideal source to distill these principles. So basing my analysis on Mu'ayyad's Majālis, I've delineated 10 interdependent principles of Fatimid symbolic interpretation. Right. Now, each principle that you see on the slide here is a complex proposition that could be discussed at length, and more tenets could be added as well. But my goal is to lay out a framework, and within that, I'll limit my remarks on each principle to its primary facets, and I'll include a couple of examples for each today. So the first one, Mu'ayyad's first principle, and I've mentioned it already, is rationality of faith. Religion is based on reason. Mu'ayyad argues that the Qur'an addresses humans who are rational beings, and it addresses them as people of reason. And it does so in several verses, including this one that you see on the slide. Be conscious of God, O people of reason. Ittaqullah ya ulil albab. Since the Qur'an's message is for rational beings, the Qur'an must be rational. So Mu'ayyad also explains that believing in something entails accepting it as true. And you cannot accept something as true without understanding it. The Qur'an's expectation of belief in the hidden truths, al-Iman bil-Ghaib, such as paradise and angels, is an expectation of believers to believe truths that may be hidden from sensory perception but are disclosed to human reason. Moving on to the second principle, this is that the Qur'an contains absolute truth and nothing is figurative. So everything is haqiqah, nothing is majaz. Mu'ayyad explains that when literal interpretation of a Quranic verse doesn't make rational sense, Sunni literalists who otherwise deny ta'wil are forced to interpret figuratively. Here they move from what they believe is the unintended literal meaning to the intended figurative meaning. Mu'ayyad takes the example of the verse that describes one who was dead, to whom God gave life and granted a light with which he walks among people. Literalists, he says, cannot claim this verse to be literally true, for we all know that dead people do not come to life and walk around in a halo of light. So they put forward a figurative interpretation. The dead person is the disbeliever. God revivifies him by granting him the gift of belief and illumines him with the light of the Qur'an. Mu'ayyad agrees with the interpretation itself. What is this, he asks, but ta'wil? But he disagrees with the label. And the label here is not just a matter of semantics, but actual conceptualization. He turns the claim of figurative interpretation on its head, asserting that what most people consider figurative is the real meaning. And what they consider the real meaning is, in fact, figurative. The natural life of a disbeliever, like the life of a grazing animal, is not real life. It may be called life only figuratively. Its end is death and annihilation. Life of the soul, earned through belief, is real life, for it is eternal. Now, the third principle is harmonization between the physical and spiritual worlds. And Mu'ayyad asserts that these are parallel, identically structured spheres of existence, and that understanding sensory objects and phenomena, mahsus in Arabic, leads to recognition of abstract concepts, ma'qul. So he cites, among other things, the Prophet's hadith: God has structured his religion on the model of his physical creation, so that proof may be inferred from his creation for his religion, and from his religion for his oneness. Here are two examples from the Majālis. So these are not on the screen. I'm just going to kind of say a few words about them. Like the sky and earth in the physical cosmos, there's a sky and earth in the spiritual cosmos. The prophet is the sky that pours forth the rain of divine knowledge. His spiritual consort, the legatee, the wasi, is the earth that receives this knowledge. Just as the earth's acceptance of the sky's rain brings forth life, the legatee's receiving of the prophet's knowledge brings forth the pure harvest, quote unquote, of souls. Here's a second example. Different people represent different animals. Some resemble predators that tear apart other animals. Others resemble snakes and scorpions that sting and bite. Yet others represent cows and asses whose sole interest is to eat and mate. Now, just as a human's bestial traits are in constant conflict with his rational soul, so too are bestial types of humanity in constant battle with the Imam. Right. Moving on to the fourth principle, which is that the Sharia's exoteric and esoteric aspects, zahir and batin, complement and validate each other. Now, although the Fatimids were often pejoratively termed batiniya, both their practice and their texts show that they assigned great importance to the Sharia's physical aspect. Throughout the Majālis, Mu'ayyad himself exhorts listeners to pray, to fast, to offer the alms levy zakat, to perform the pilgrimage to Mecca, and to stay away from forbidden acts. But what differentiates the Fatimids from the majority is their equal emphasis on understanding the inner meaning. Without the esoteric aspect, they deem the exoteric aspect of religion incomplete. And Mu'ayyad explains, and I have his text translated on the slide. When a person faces the direction of prayer, he faces the corporal Kaaba with his corporal body, and the sublime Kaaba with his sublime soul. He faces with his corporal body that into which it will assimilate, and he faces with his sublime soul that to which it will return. The Kaaba symbolizes the Imam. You should worship God with your body by praying toward the physical Kaaba, and you should worship God with your soul by pledging allegiance to the Imam, who is the spiritual Kaaba, God's vicegerent on earth. Point 5 is about the substance of ta'wil, the content. What is the actual content? And Mu'ayyad explains ta'wil as the concealed truths, ghaib, that we already encountered. And then he enumerates these as the hereafter. This is a text from Mu'ayyad's Majālis. He himself is telling you what ta'wil is about, what al-ghaib is. He enumerates the content of ghaib as the hereafter, angels, hudud, and above all, the Creator. These truths, he says, are hidden from the senses, and I've already mentioned this, but the intellect can perceive them. A detailed list of ta'wil themes is provided by the Yamani Tayyibi Da'i, Hatim Muhyiddin, in his abridgment of the Majālis Jami' al-Haqa'iq. And the list is just his chapter headings, right? As you see on this list, ta'wil concentrates on God's unity, tawheed, which is number 1, chapter number 1, and the workings of God's mission, the da'wah, all throughout. Moving on, the next principle is live history. For the Fatimids, Quranic accounts of earlier prophets have full relevance to the present time. The stories of Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and all other savants mentioned in the Qur'an are not merely records of events that happened in the past. They are that, but they are also an explanation of what is happening in Muhammad's community in the present and an indication of what will happen in the future. And Mu'ayyad often quotes the Prophet Muhammad's hadith, which is on the slide here. You, my community, will experience events experienced by communities of the past. Shoe for shoe and feather for feather. حذو النعل بالنعل والقذة بالقذة. If they went down an iguana's den, جحر ضب, if they went down an iguana's den, you will go down it too. Here's another hadith that Mu'ayyad cites to endorse his approach. My kin are like Noah's ark. Those who climb aboard are saved, those who don't drown. مثل أهل بيتي فيكم كسفينة نوح من ركبها نجا ومن تخلف عنها غرق. All right. Now, principle point number 7. The Fatimids, which is about the methodology of ta'wil. The Fatimids harnessed scriptural and rational proofs in support of their exegesis. And by the way, there's a very interesting similar claim to using shara'i and aqli proofs earlier in the Rasail Ikhwan al-Safa. Mu'ayyad's methods of ta'wil derivation include cosmology, anatomy, function, numerology, and etymology. All of these are very interesting. I don't have time to go into them, but I will give you 2 examples which showcase 2 of these methods. So in terms of numerology, the 28 Arabic letters of the Islamic creed, there is no God but God, la ilaha illallah, denote 28 rank holders in the spiritual hierarchy. Another example, and this is based on etymology, on derivation from the Arabic language, the Arabic word munafiq, and you might want to follow along because it's a little bit intricate here. It's usually translated as hypocrite, and it denotes the da'wah's internal enemies. The word is derived from the Arabic nafiqa al-yarbuh, nafiqa al-yarbuh, a jerboa rodent's den. A rodent's den, yeah? And the specialty of this den is that it has 2 exits. If you corner a jerboa in one, it comes out of the other. Similarly, a hypocrite changes his position to suit his convenience. Point number 8, being ta'wil as the true knowledge integral to salvation. Now, the Fatimids regarded the inner meaning of the Qur'an and Sharia as the real knowledge which, alongside good deeds, led to salvation. So this is the ibadah ilmiyya that you heard about earlier. Mu'ayyad states in his Majālis, which expound the Imam's true knowledge, that his Majālis are the water of life, the immortalizing light. Those among his audience who listen with a true heart ascend to spiritual perfection. I'll let you take a quick look at this slide, which has 2 further examples. I won't read it out in the interest of time. All right, moving right along. The overarching principle is the sole God-given authority of Muhammad, Ali, and each Imam after them to communicate and interpret God's message. He has the exclusive ability to receive direct divine communication. He is the speaking Qur'an, the interpreter who decodes God's message for humanity. And here are 2 scriptural arguments for that. So the first one is before you on the slide. The Prophet said, I leave 2 weighty things with you, God's book and my descendants. You will not go astray if you hold tight to both. They will never be separated until they come to me together at the celestial pool. So as Mu'ayyad goes on to say, the book does not exist except with the Imams, and the Imams do not exist except with the book. Here's another example. The Qur'an says ta'wil is known only to God and to those who have a firm base in knowledge. The Sunni reading, as many of you probably know, is with a waqf after the word Allah. That means that the Qur'an's meaning is known only to God. Mu'ayyad says this is illogical. For what is the point of revealing something to humankind whose meaning they can never know? Here's a final argument in this point, and it's based on reason. So Mu'ayyad says that the eye can perceive only if it has light. In a dark room, the blind and the sighted are equal. Similarly, the mind needs light to see. The Prophet, legatee, and Imams are the sun, moon, and stars, and it's only with the light of their knowledge that human minds perceive higher truths. I want to note here very quickly that the famous Sunni theologian Ghazali ridiculed the Fatimid doctrine of ta'lim, and he said it was physically impossible to approach the Imam about every little thing. But Ghazali had either misunderstood or was deliberately misrepresenting them. As explained by the Tayyibi Da'i Ali ibn Muhammad ibn al-Walid, believers do not seek out the Imam physically to ask about every single thing. The Imam answers some questions personally and trains some individuals directly, but on a larger scale, he appoints and supervises a hierarchy of rank holders who convey his knowledge to the general populace. A clear picture of this system is found in Qadi Nu'man's Ikhtilaf Usul al-Madhahib, with a wonderful translation by Devin Stewart sitting here. A clear picture is found in Imam Mu'izz's letter of appointment for Qadi Nu'man as chief judge. So after authorizing Nu'man to derive rulings from the Qur'an, Hadith, and sayings of the Imam, and after explaining the method of inference that he should follow, that Qadi Nu'man should follow, Mu'izz tells him that if he remains unsure on any point, he is to consult the Imam himself, Mu'izz. And moving on to the last point, the rationale for ta'wil. So if the point is to inform humanity of God and their relationship to Him, why not just tell it like it is? Why have ta'wil at all? Mu'ayyad addresses this question in several places in his Majālis, and here's one point in brief. So this is not on the screen. The screen I'm going to refer to in a second. So here's one of his arguments for this. Humans are not alike in their cognitive capacity. So this is Mu'ayyad's Majālis. One needs both intelligence and training to reach the stage where one can grasp higher truths. A graded system of learning ensures that only those who can digest it are given this knowledge when they are ready for it. And I'll let you take just a momentary look at the slide, which has two further examples. All right. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. As we've seen, Mu'ayyad's 10 principles of ta'wil together articulate a coherent system of hermeneutics which maintains that the Qur'an and Sharia are rational and consistent. Mu'ayyad's ta'wil system, as you know, continued to be applied after him, and his Persian student Nasir Khusro reflected his master's approach, and Nizari's accessed Mu'ayyad's teachings largely through Nasir's works, and many have been translated, several by the Institute. One is coming forth, the Wajh-e-Din, I am told, by Shafiq Birani. Looking forward to that. The Tayyibis in Yemen and India carried forth Mu'ayyad's direct legacy, as seen, for example, in Da'i Hatim's Majālis abridgment, and you saw the chapter headings a few minutes ago. And the Tayyibis follow Mu'ayyad's ta'wil system and his teachings of Fatimid doctrine to the present day. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Qutbuddin. So it is my pleasure to invite now our conference convener, Dr. Daryoush Mohammad Poor, to read the paper of Professor Hermann Landolt, titled "The Question by Kumayl ibn Ziyād to Ali ibn Abī Ṭālīb, Some Notes on a Spurious Tradition Generating Important Interpretations." So then our next speaker will be Professor Devin Stewart, and then Dr. Sultonbek Aksakolov.
Well, good afternoon. Apologies for impersonating Professor Landolt, one of our senior scholars. Fortunately, he couldn't be with us today. So please forgive me if I make any mistakes, but I'll try to focus on it as clearly as I can. So the famous Hadith al-Haqiqa, the tradition according to which Kumayl ibn Ziyād al-Nakha'i asked his master Ali ibn Abī Ṭālīb during a camel ride in the desert, what is the truth? Mal haqiqa. And the latter is retorting, what have you got to do with the truth? Ma laka wal haqiqa. As well as Ali's indirect answers to Kumayl by subsequently offering a series of cryptic allusions to the created order of the world from the morning of pre-eternity, Subh al-Azal, to the time of extinguishing the night light, is not, strictly speaking, a hadith supported by a chain of transmitters. It is, however, a Sufi tradition of obviously Shi'i origin. As such, it has frequently been the subject of commentaries by later Sufis, particularly the followers of Ibn al-Arabi, such as Abdul Razzaq al-Kashani, as well as the latter's counterpart among the Sufis critical of Ibn Arabi's doctrine of unity of being, Wahdat al-Wujud, the Qubrawi Alauddin Alauddawla Semnani. It nevertheless remained a major source of inspiration for still later Sufi poets and Shi'i philosophers up to the present time, including those of the so-called Shaykhi school. All this was, of course, of greatest interest to the late Henri Corbin. Without attempting here to summarize Corbin's monumental On Islam Iranian, it can be said that this phenomenological approach to the religions of the book was at least in part influenced by his own understanding of Martin Heidegger's radical philosophy of being and time, whose political implications he did not investigate. As is also known, Corbin took it upon himself to explain the remarkable combination of Sufi hermeneutics and Shi'i theology in the prolific writings of Sayyid Haydar Amoli, the Sufi from the North Iranian region of Amol, who traveled many times to Iraq in order to meditate at the tombs of the Shi'i Imams. What Corbin emphasized is that Amoli openly declared that the true Shi'i must be a Sufi, just as the true Sufi can only be a Shi'i. In the present context, it should, however, be added that Amoli most saliently excludes the Ismailis or Seveners from the esoteric Shi'i traditions he so fervently defended. A slightly different version of Kumayl tradition can be found in the Nahjul Balagha. There, Ali explains to Kumayl that humans are of three categories. 1, the masters of divine knowledge, Alim Rabbani. 2, those people learning on the path of salvation at doomsday, Muta'allim, ala sabil al-najah. And 3, the mob whose way of life is to follow every bleater like sheep, turning to every wind, devoid of the light of knowledge. They cannot find safety in any firm shelter. Lastly, Ali reminds Kumayl that knowledge is better than the wealth of this world. A similar division of the wise, Hakim, into 10 categories was proposed by the Ishraqi philosopher Sohrawardi, executed in or about 587-1191 by order of the famous Ayyubid Sultan of Aleppo, in the prologue to his Hikmat al-Ishraq, but no trace of either version of the Kumayl tradition can be found in the classical Sufi manuals of the 5th or 11th century, such as al-Bushayri's al-Risala or Hujwiri's Kashf al-Mahjub, not to be confused with the Ismaili treatise of the same title by Abu Ya'qub al-Sijistani. This is perhaps not very surprising, since both these Sufi authorities are clearly of a Sunni persuasion. Hujwiri was a great traveler in search of knowledge throughout the lands of the Eastern Caliphate, from Syria to the borderlands of the Indian subcontinent. He divided the varieties of Sufi thought and experience into 10 groups, but simply excluded all Shias, including the Qarmatis and the Shi'is of Egypt, who were the Fatimid Ismailis, from the common fold of the Muslim community as heretics or apostates. Nor can the Kumayl tradition be found in the 10-volume account of Muslim saints by Abu Nu'aym al-Isfahani, the Hilyatul Awliya of 430, although this collection does include the pro-Shi'i traditions from the family of the Prophet. The significance of Hujwiri's Kashf al-Mahjub can be seen in the fact that he defends Hussein ibn Mansur al-Hallaj, the eccentric mystic known for a famous poem suggesting incarnation or hulul of the divine spirit in his own body, and suspected in caliphal circles of qarmati activities or unlawful behavior, and he was executed in 309-922 in Baghdad. However, Hujwiri also rejects two groups related one way or another to the impact of Hallaj's persona on Muslim society, a group of followers he calls incarnationists or hululiyun, and a group only pretending to be his followers, blamed for neglecting the religious obligations of the Shariat. In fact, he claims to have seen a group of heretics, Malahida in Baghdad, who were exaggerating devotion to Hallaj, just like the Shia, Rawafid, exaggerated devotion or tawalla to Ali ibn Abī Ṭālīb. He also makes an effort to save Hallaj from confusion with an apparently notorious heretic of Baghdad, Mulhid al-Baghdadi, whom he takes to have been the teacher of the famous physician, alchemist and philosopher of Ray, Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, and the companion of the Gharbati, Abu Sa'id al-Jannabi. As a theological authority, Hujwiri consistently argues that the controversial interpretation of the Quranic notion of the spirit, Mas'alat al-Ruh, as an uncreated entity, cites the definition of monotheism, Tawheed, as separation of the eternal from the temporally originated, Ifrad al-Qidam wal-Hadath, and al-Hadath, and subsequently distinguishes Islam as pure monotheism from both the Christian doctrine of divine incarnation, hulul, and the widespread belief in reincarnation of the soul, or metempsychosis, tanasukh, or nasakh al-arwah, which he rejected in no uncertain terms, as did his Ismaili contemporary, the more famous Nasir Khusro. This rejection, of course, raises a number of other questions. One wonders, first of all, whether the inventor of our Sufi hadith was an unconventional Sufi such as Sohrawardi Ishraqi or an Ismaili Neoplatonist like Sijistani, and also why the followers of the Shaykhi school wrote divergent commentaries suggesting opposite notions of the soul from the above to below or vice versa. And this brings the paper to an end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daryoush, and thanks to Professor Landolt. So our next speaker is Professor Devin Stewart from Emory University, and the title of his paper is The Debate of Abūl-Fatḥ al-Karājikī on Legal Analogy at the Dar al-Ilm in Fatimid, Cairo. Please.
So, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank our convener, Daryoush Mohammad Poor, and all of the people who worked very hard at the Institute to make this event possible. I'd also like to thank you all for coming. I'm going to speak to you today about a figure named Abūl-Fatḥ al-Karājikī, who is a 12-er Shiite scholar from the first half of the 11th century. He appears to be somewhat obscure, even from the 12-er Shiite point of view. His main claim to fame in 12-er Shiite historiography is that he's one of the many students of a very famous scholar, the Sheikh al-Mufid, who was the leading scholar in Baghdad at the end of the 10th century, beginning of the 11th century. And he has a well-known anthology called Kanz al-Fawaid. And that includes something that's quite important, a summary of a Sheikh al-Mufid's book on Usul al-Fiqh, which we don't have in any other form. From the Ismaili point of view, his importance is entirely negative. He's the source of a mistake, right? He's an unwitting source of this. He wrote commentaries on two books by al-Qadi Nu'man, And this came into the Twelver Shiite biographical tradition. And because of that, a number of later Twelver Shiite scholars think that al-Qadi Noman was a Twelver Shiite, which is kind of preposterous because he is the architect of the entire structure of Ismaili law. So this is al-Karajiki's fault, but he didn't intend it, right? So I would like to argue that al-Karājikī is a little more important than those items of interest would tend to make one think, and that he's also representative of a group that we know very little about because books have not been preserved. There were probably more scholars like him who were Twelver Shiites who were active in the Fatimid Empire. So the bigger ideas that are connected with this are the following. The extent of Shiite presence in Egypt is often discounted when it existed before the Fatimids were there. It's discounted when the Fatimids were in Egypt, and it's discounted afterwards, mainly because later Sunnis, and especially Egyptians, think that there aren't any Shiites here now, so there must never have been Shiites. Right? There's a modern Egyptian scholar literally said the following. He said, well, of course, you know that the Egyptians would never have converted to Shiism because they're very pious. It was a typical attitude. Anyway, in the mix, one needs to realize that many of these Shiites were Twelvers, both before the Fatimid period, during the Fatimid period, and after the Fatimid period. There were people who converted to Ismaili Shiism, we know that, but there were also a Twelver community, which eventually died out. People either converted or left. And because of that, and because of what happened to the intellectual legacy of the Shiites in Egypt and in Syria, that we know very little about that. And it's in great contrast to what happened in Baghdad. For some reason, we have a lot of information about the Shiites in Baghdad that got preserved. And part of it, I assume, was because when the Buwayhids fell, the Seljuks conquered Baghdad, they saved the books by bringing them to places like Hilla, like Najaf in southern Iraq, and many books survive. So someone like Sharif al-Murtada, we have dozens and dozens of his books have been preserved. Sheikh al-Mufid, dozens of books have been preserved. And there are other people, like al-Mas'udi was from Baghdad and went to Egypt. He wrote many books, and 2 have been preserved. So this is just an indication of something. The Twelver Shiites and the Ismailis were in constant debate and contact. And al-Karājikī gives some examples of that they agreed on certain things. So the Twelvers and the Ismailis agreed that qiyas was wrong in law, like using the method of legal analysis. That was a shared opinion and something that they could agree on. And Sumaya Hamdani, in her book, made a very insightful remark. She said, I'm gonna get the quotation wrong, but essentially she said that there was contact and debate between the Twelvers and the Ismailis, much more than we know. And I think this is what this is about. In addition, the Twelvers were involved in the Fatimid judiciary. Right? We know this, especially when Qutaifat took over and became vizier and declared a state in the name of the 12th Imam. He instituted 4 judgeships, and one of them was a Twelver Shiite. So that's just one example, but we know from al-Karājikī, we'll see that he was involved. The other thing that's important to note is that this came up in David Hollenberg's talk, right? That research in our field has been occurring in silos, and you expect, okay, the Sunnis are going to ignore the Shiites, right? But also we see that the Shiites are often ignoring the Sunnis, and different groups among the Shiites are ignoring each other. So this gives you an example of this. All right. So, though he was a 12er Shiite, al-Karājikī had his entire career in the Fatimid Empire. Right? And this is kind of, when you read 12er scholarship, you lose this entirely. There's a modern Lebanese scholar named Ja'far al-Muhajir wrote a book about al-Karājikī, which is the most complete discussion of al-Karājikī to date. And he wants to make him like a modern Lebanese nationalist Shiite, right? He wants to say he's from Tarablis. We know he was in Tarablis, but I don't think he's from Tarablis. He wants to say he's from Tarablis, and he's 12er Shiite, and he had positions in Syria. He never says this was in the Fatimid Empire. He is working as a judge under the leadership of the governors of various cities in the Fatimid Empire. His patrons included the chief Qadi of the Fatimid Empire and a number of governors in Syria. He engaged with Ismaili scholarship. We mentioned he wrote those two commentaries on works by al-Qadi and Nauman, and we have some other examples. He was in Dar al-Ilm in Cairo, which is what I'm going to talk about a little later, and he recorded the debate that he held there in Dar al-Ilm. So this is the Fatimid Empire showing where he was, and he was in a number of cities in Syria that were all under the Fatimid Empire. Ja'far al-Muhajir kind of, he mainly doesn't mention it, but even when he was in Tarablis, which became independent afterwards, after al-Karajiki's death, it became independent, but everywhere he was part of the empire. So we don't know a lot about his life. There's no way we can give a nice biographical account of his life. We have sort of mentions, and they're mostly from his anthology. He mentions, I was here in this date. The other main source, we have a catalog of his works by someone who's probably a student of his from the generation right after him, and that includes information on the patrons of some of his works and gives the dates of some of his works. Right? There's some confusion in the literature. I argue that he's from a place that's now in Anatolia near Diyarbakir, and this is obscured in the tradition. The biographical works say his name comes from a word for tents, and that Karajik meant tents. I've tried to figure out how Karajik means tents in Persian, Turkish, whatever. It doesn't sound like Arabic, and I came up with nothing. And I think he's from a Turkish town called Karajik, right? Karajik is between Diyarbakir and Batman, right? Batman. So he's near the town of Batman, right? And the reason I think this is correct is that the first date we have of his from his anthology is that he was in Maya Fariqin, which is now called Silvan in Turkish, in 399, when he must have been quite young, but he's old enough to be a student of a major scholar. He's describing that he's receiving an ijazah from a scholar. So, and that's not too far away from Karajik. So I think he's from this area, which is north of Syria, and that he was Arab. I don't think it was Turk, either he was Arab, and that he grew up in the region of Syria, and that's why he went to study in Baghdad with the major 12er scholars in Baghdad, but he came back to the Fatimid Empire because that was closer to home. So this just shows you where Diyarbakir is in that southern, over in the southeast corner of Anatolia. Then we have a number of dates from his anthologies, and we see he was in Maya Fariqin in 1009, right? He was in Egypt in 407, 1017, right? And then he was in the Ramla for a number of years in 410, 411, 412 Hijri, right? So what I think this shows is that he was in his home region. Then he went to study in Baghdad. We don't have any dated times of his in Baghdad, but then he went to Egypt after that. This is not exactly established in the scholarship, as we'll see, but I think he went, after he finished his education in Baghdad, he went to Egypt to get a job. Right? And he got a job, and his job was in the Ramla, which was the capital of Palestine at the time. Right? So it was the capital of Palestine until the Crusades, and then things changed. So anyway, we'll go on. And then he was in a number of cities in Syria. Then he went to Cairo again. Right? So we know he was in Bilbais, which is on the road from Syria to Cairo in 418. So that's when he was going. And then he was in Cairo in 424 and then in 426. So it seems like he was in Cairo for quite a period after that. And it could have been up to 18 years because the next date we have, he was in Tarablus in 436. So he was in Cairo the second time at least 8 years and probably more than that, and perhaps as many as 18 years. And he died in Tyre, in Sur, right, in 1057. So he went to Baghdad. So Hassan Ansari, a very, very good scholar, looked at al-Karajiki's dates, and he assumed that al-Karājikī went back to Baghdad after he was in Cairo. I don't think that's what happened. I think he was in Baghdad first, then he went to Cairo, then he got a job, and he didn't go back to Baghdad. Now, the proof is that in his anthology, he says in two places that Sharif al-Radi recited a poem to him. Sharif al-Radi died in 406, right, in 1015, so he must have been in Baghdad before then. So that to me makes it pretty clear. And it's clear that he used Nashj al-Balagha in his anthology. He quoted from the work a number of times. And we know that Sharif al-Radi stayed in Baghdad. He didn't really go, as far as we know, outside Baghdad. So then he went to Egypt, and I assume he went to Egypt to get a job. This is mainly speculation, but how would you get a job when you go to Egypt? I think the way, and this I could use some help from some people, I think what happened was that you went to the chief judge. The chief judge was in charge of all of the judgeships throughout the entire empire, and so he could appoint you to be judge. And you had to impress him, become his friend, write a nice book for him, dedicate it to him, or give him a pile of money. So I think as al-Karājikī was young, he didn't give him a pile of money. He probably wrote something to him, and we know this from later. So the next we see of him, he was in a Ramla, and it's clear he had a job in the Ramla. We don't know exactly what it is, right? It could have been judge, could have been deputy judge, assistant judge, or some other position. Now, the thing that makes it clear to me that this was how patronage was working is that we have in his catalog of works, one work was written while he was in Ramla and dedicated to the chief judge. This tells me that if it's from this period, it's for the judge Ibn Abi al-Awwam, who we know was judge from 405 to 418, that is 1015 to 1027. And why would he be writing a book for the chief judge when he's sitting in the Ramla? Because he wants a different, better job. That's what he wants a raise. Right? So this is the thing. And that tells me that's how that's working. So many of the things that we know about him are just based on a tiny little piece of information. We don't have any narrative account that says, this is why he did this, right? So we have to. He has a number of other works that are dedicated to people who were governors of various cities in Syria. The one that I've been able to identify is a man named Nasir ad-Dawla, who was the governor of Damascus. He's fairly well known, and we know exactly when he was in Damascus. This is from 433 to 440, or 1042 to, I can't read my thing here, to 1048. So during that time, al-Karājikī may have been in Damascus, he may have been in another town in Syria, but he dedicated several works to him. And this shows that he was in a network of patronage that involved the Fatimid governors. He has two other governors to whom he dedicated works, named Sarim ad-Dawla, perhaps the governor of Tiberias, and Dhukhr ad-Dawla, who seems to have been the governor of Saida, or Sidon, because it says that he was there. Then he was associated with the Banu Ammar, who were in Tarablus. So all of these were part of the Fatimid governorships. Then, his second trip to Egypt, he went in 418 Hijri, right, which would have been 1026 or 1027. He stayed there, like we said, at least 8 years and maybe as much as 18 years. And he has two debates from this time in his anthology. One he had in Bilbais, and at Bilbais he met with a number of scholars and they debated. So he's representing the Mu'tazili school. He thought of himself as mainly a theologian more than a jurist, and he's representing the Mu'tazili view that God must be just. And they asked him, okay, so if you say God must be just, why do people get eternally punished? Right? It doesn't seem to make sense as being just if they can only do a finite amount of damage while they're here on earth. How can you punish them an infinite amount? So he tries to answer that question, and in the course of it, he insults a Shafi'i. So there's a Shafi'i jurist there, and you see maybe he's doing this to be on the good side of an Ismaili host or something, but he says, the jurist says, well, a Shafi'i says this, and he tells him, well, you know, a Shafi'i is not really known as a theologian, so his opinion means nothing, right? So we need to rely on people who are professional. So this is his, okay. Then he wrote, like I was mentioned, commentaries on Ismaili works. The two works are by al-Qari Nauman. The big one is the Da'im, so he wrote a commentary on the Da'im, and he wrote another book that is al-Ikhtiyar min al-Akhbar, which is about hadith. So then, we will go over that. So we know from his catalog, he wrote a number of books in Egypt, so it's pretty clear he was in Egypt for a while. A number of patrons are mentioned. There's someone named Abūl-Yaqḍān. I haven't been able to determine who Abūl-Yaqḍān is, but it would, if we can just find out who that one person is, it might help a lot. Then, so we know he was interested in Ismaili law because he wrote a book on the disputed points between the Ismailis and the Twelvers having to do with marriage, as one of the entries in his catalog. Now, he was at Dar al-Ilm and he describes this debate about qiyas held at Dar al-Ilm, and we learned from this a number of things. One, that there were Twelver Shiites at Dar al-Ilm. Two, that they had debate between Shiites and Sunnis on this, because his opponent is clearly a Sunni. He is, and I assume that he's championing this opinion, not just because it's the Twelver point of view, but also because it happens to be the Ismaili point of view, and he's trying to win points with patrons. Right? He doesn't date it, so we don't know when it happened, but it's very clear that it was probably during that second period when he was in Egypt, right? Now, there is we'll skip this. Okay, so he mentions in his anthology two places where he was looking at books on astronomy at the Dar al-Ilm. So this is somewhat unusual among Twelver religious scholars to be that interested in astronomy. These are straight up astronomical works that are about the constellations. There's a book by Ibn Hibinta, which is very famous. There's another book called by a Sufi called Surah al-Kawakib al-Thabita, and he describes looking at them. He wrote himself some works on astronomy, and I think he's interested in astronomy partly because he's in disputes with Ismailis about how to determine the beginning of Ramadan, and can you do it by astronomical methods. Then there's a possibility that he was actually the librarian at Darul-Ilm. Why might I think this? So the ultimate source that is quoted in later Shiite sources is the Shahid al-Awwal. The Shahid al-Awwal is named Muhammad ibn Makki al-Jazini. He died in the 14th century, and he, according to the source, had a majmu'ah, a collective manuscript, and in it he mentions that al-Karājikī was Khazan Darul-Ilm in Ramla. Right, so Khazan Darul-Ilm would be like the librarian of Darul-Ilm, and he says in Ramla, and to me that sounds funny because Darul-Ilm is in Baghdad, and is in Cairo, and I don't think there was another one in Ramla, so I suspect that Shahid al-Awwal read something, he knew that al-Karājikī was in Ramla, and he read something that said he was Khazan Darul-Ilm, and he just conflated the two. So perhaps he was actually the librarian of Darul-Ilm, and if he was, we know his salary because it's in the Waqf document. He is 48 dinars a month, which is okay, not too bad. Then he has the debate about Qiyas and Darul-Ilm. We don't have time to go through details, but essentially what I think you can show from the text of the debate is that he is quoting some of his arguments from al-Qadi Nu'man's book, Ikhtilaf Usul al-Madahib. He's quoting arguments against Qiyas that are from al-Qadi Nu'man's work. And I guess the last thing I'll say, I think he's not the only one, meaning he's not the only 12er Shiite who was active in the Fatimid Empire. Because there were employment opportunities, so people could, there were other people who studied in Baghdad with the great Shiite scholars that were there, Sheikh al-Mufid, Sharif al-Mu'tara, Sheikh al-Tusi during the Boyhood period, and then came to Syria. We know some of them. Ibn Barraj ended up in Tarablus, and there's a number of them. And I think that there was a lot more we just don't know about because their books haven't been preserved. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. So I invite now Dr. Sultonbek Aksakolov, who will talk about secular archives as news sources on the Ismailis of Central Asia, analysis of the state records and reports from Soviet Badakhshan. Please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, colleagues, classmates, my professors, and it's my great pleasure to be here, and I'm thankful for Dr. Daryoush for convening this conference to include me, and of course for Dr. Daryoush to give me this opportunity to present here today the finding of my research. My presentation is a little bit different from the panel which talks about Ismaili literature, but I'm talking about the sources which are of equal importance to the scholars, like the sources on early Islamic history or early Ismaili history or medieval Ismaili history. I'm talking about Soviet archives, about the reports which are preserved. Okay. While it takes some time, I will talk about the archives which exist in in present territories of Tajikistan and Russia. And before studying these archives, we need to know about the context in which they were produced. These archives were produced on Ismailis and any other Muslim believers or any other religious believers in a very hostile context. In the context of the 20th century when there was a struggle between secularism and religion, but in Soviet context it is more hostile, secular atheistic struggle with religion. Can you hear me? Yes. Good. So to understand the context, I will be very brief. In 1918, the Soviet came to power, and one of the first things that they declared, it was the separation of religion from state and church from school. And then it was implemented differently in different contexts. To the Muslim context, it reached in the late 1920s. Initially, the Soviet did not target the the Muslims, but gradually they destroyed them till the 1940s, all one by one. Yeah. In the context of Gorno-Badakhshan, which I'm talking, the struggle went the same way, like in the other Muslim parts of Soviet Central Asia. Initially, the Soviet co-opted the religious leaders. Gradually, they destroyed and repressed them. So repression of religious personnel, ban of religious practices, closure of the borders. That means the Ismailis of Gorno-Badakhshan, which are the subject of my today's presentation, they lost connection with their fellow believers. Yeah? And then we have a World War II, which is a concession, Stalinist concession to all believers. So we will see how our archives tell us about what the Ismailis used of this momentum. And the last part, which I'm talking, mainly focusing, it is a control and regulation of religious affairs, which are my archives about. Yeah. So what kind of religious station existed in Soviet Badakhshan? Before analyzing these archives as a sources on Ismailis, we need to know this. What kind of policy did the Soviet pursue against religion? Did this policy remain the same, as many scholars generalized before accessing or without accessing these archives, that it was the same, the Soviet were triumphant, Islam was, always a victim, religious clergy disappeared? My archives will tell today a different story. How did the centralized Soviet policy was translated into practice among different communities, including the Ismailis? These are the questions that I'm asking to read these sources, because these sources were produced, again, in a very hostile milieu for a specific purpose, for a centralized state policy. But we can draw conclusion from them, we can reread them, understanding the context, we can reread them, and we can see a rich encounters between what was to be a Ismailism and what was to be a Soviet religion. How did the Ismailis respond to the Soviet religious policy? How did the Ismaili religious leaders function in a changing context of the Soviet religious policy and anti-religious atheist propaganda? What kind of impact did the Soviet religious policy have on the religious leaders and on the practice of religion? How did religious personnel preserve and transmit religious knowledge and practice? So the archives which I'm talking about, they have not been accessible prior to 91 and by and large by 2000. The first scholar which got access to these archives in academic terms, it was Yakov Roy. I was lucky enough to receive 300 pages of archives from him from University of Tel Aviv, and then later I went to Moscow and did my research in 3 archives in Moscow to collect these data, these reports. These reports were produced by a person which the Soviet nominated called Uполномоченный по делам религии. So in Commissioner for Religious Affairs, in Tajik it is Wakil-e-Din. So the Soviet tried from 1933 onwards, after the repression, after the concession to the religious believers, the Soviet tried to appoint a special person to study, analyze, observe, regulate, monitor, but to not interfere in religious affairs. So that's what the Soviet policy changed. In Gorno-Badakhshan, the first commissioner was appointed in 1950s, and 6 of them served till 1991. I interviewed the last commissioner, where in my PhD I talk about it. So you can see to the right the stamp of the office which functioned among the Ismailis. Yeah? These archives, as I mentioned, I collected them in Moscow, in 3 archives, in Dushanbe and in Khorog. So these are the sources which I refer to. These are files and rich body of text. So they are written in different ways. So what do they tell us about religious life? The first thing that the commissioners or the wakil or the upol did, they were tasked to observe and analyze detailed observation analysis of religious life in Gorno-Badakhshan. They would report on religious station. They would report on religious station, and they would provide a quarterly statistics on how many khalifas, maybe in modern period, similar to perhaps Itreb or another office would do this kind of activities. They will quarterly report on the celebration of Eid Qurban and Eid Ramadan. They would also write to the state about activization or intensification of the activities of the khalifas and peers. They would also write particularly to what extent these khalifas, not peers, Khalifas, mullahs, ishans, Azayim Khans, Dua Khans, how they influenced the youth, the Soviet youth. They would also inform the state about the level of religious education. And of course, last but not least, the religious rights. But despite the fact that in Gorno-Badakhshan we have two communities, Sunnis and Ismailis, what the Soviets were interested in each report from Moscow to the commissioner in Khorog, you need to write to us about detailed features of Ismailism in the region. Why? Because the Soviets were concerned, A, because of the connection the Ismailis might have, border connection. Gorno-Badakhshan is a border region. B, there was a distinct feature of the community. It did not have registered prayer house. Prior to 1940s, there were 14 or 47 mosques and Jamaat Khanas mentioned in the archives, but all of them were closed. So the Soviets, from 1950s, when the Soviets changed their policy, we need to come in terms with the believing citizens, we need to respect their right. So you, as a wakil, need to write on it. Detailed features of the activities of the followers Ismaili sect. So the Sunni sect report was not stressed that much. Yeah? So the first commissioner, he says that, he provides the number of khalifas and mullahs who were conducting rites. Their numbers were more. They increased till 1960s. He stated that, tentative numbers, but the very first appointment of this office started a new period which lasted for 4 decades, and it placed religious figures under close surveillance by commissioners on the one hand, and by the local Communist Party leaders on the other hand. So a Khalifa or a Mullah now doesn't matter. He's official Soviet Khalifas. His life is in a triangle. It functioned in a triangle. And he has to comply with Soviet legislation on religion. So these are the statistics in 1950. So you can see that 42 Khalifas, and altogether we have 103 Ishans. And in the years of repression, these numbers would have been impossible to find out. But why these numbers sprang? Why we have, all of a sudden in 1950s, we have many Khalifas? This is because of the temporary concession that Stalin gave to the believers. So now for the Soviets is a headache, how to contain the influence of these Khalifas. These are the archives. So my story is the story of archives, but interpretations are because of my analysis and compare. So you have the Khalifas, you have their religious education. You can see barely one of them or few of them have higher religious education. That means these people, among Ismailis, these people studied in some madrasas in abroad, Afghanistan or somewhere. The Sunnis studied in Bukhara, which was officially opened. So these are and you see that there are many numbers of them. So most of the Khalifas are classified. This is very interesting categorization. They are classified with the secondary religious education, meaning they've only studied in the family maktab. That's the archives mention it clearly. So this is the Soviet categorization, and none of them had a secular education, higher secular education. So this is the archive, so you can see how the commissioner analyzed it. And these are again the archives. And the other things that the Soviets were also now categorizing what types they are, yeah? Khalifas, Dua Khans. Apart from Khalifa, who was the head of community, you have somebody who recites the prayer. And then the Yimangus, who will recite prayer during circumcision or other. And then you have the Madakhans, the Soviet classifies them. And then you have the Khaldun, the sorcerers, the one who makes talisman. And then you have Sheikhs, the custodian of shrines and mazars. And then you have few bibliotuns. This is none of the scholarship on Ismailis in Soviet Central Asia talks about maktab or bibliotuns, but the hostile archive, like Bertels, Semyonov, Dodekhodoev, all of these scholarships are based on, by and large, on a secondary analysis of religious life or primary text from historical period, but no one talks about lived religion in communist period. So these archives talk about it. And we have, for instance, we have total number of believers. What is interesting to note, believers are defined, how they are defined. First, the commissioner makes the whole population, but then from then he takes the worship, he takes deduct the worshippers. It means how many people in each village prayed. So these are the believing citizens. Yeah? So you have the clergy, the duchovenstva, you have the believers, veruющие. Now what is next? You have assessed the situation. You have reported to the Soviet Union that number of khalifas increased, number of sorcerers and other sheikhs and Yamangui increased. So what is next? Here comes Nikita Khrushchev, famous Soviet leaders, which initially denounced Stalin's activity, but gradually tightens the bolt, as we know, use it in Tajikistan. He starts to, and he gradually reduces the number of khalifas. So khalifas are now reduced not per village or per family, but per village councils, which means one khalifa for few villages. And for the whole Khorog cities, one khalifas, and their number from 47 is reduced to 24. By the end of Soviet Union, we have 26 khalifas, officially khalifas. The rest of the people become itinerary mullahs or unregistered. So this means they are acting clandestinely, but khalifas are the ones who are appointed. So what happens to these officially registered khalifas now? Yeah, we have a series document profiles for them. First, the community nominate them. The appeal is made to them, to the local government. Then the biography of candidate, it has to go through KGB. You know, the Khalifa has to have no connection with the peers. One, it has no connection with the anti-Soviet rebellion or groups. And it fills the anketa and, of course, photo and registration card. I will show you. So you see the appeal from the believers, you have the Khalifa's appeal, you have the number of people who have signed and made a petition that we, for this village council, need a Khalifa to be appointed. And then, of course, you have his own writing where he confesses that I am the son of somebody, and then I am working and I am loyal to Soviet. So this is the biography. These are very rich. Some biographies are in Persian, some are in Russian, some are in Tajiks. If someone wants to write the life of the Khalifas, I will be very quick. I'm almost to the end, yeah? And then you have their files. So you have this is progressive Khalifas in Soviet time in 1960s. We have some few Khalifas who are officially Khalifas, but they are very rebellion. And the archives mention it. These Khalifas get into debate with the Soviet. Can you imagine an archive which is produced by the commissioner who is communist? I really like these commissioners, their work, because they are writing something and hiding from Moscow, similar to Taqiyya in a secular context. Because they don't provide a great picture to Moscow, and Moscow does not find. So this is one of the Khalifa who is a follower of new ritualist. The Soviet divided the Ismailis based on the reform that Majālis Mu'ayyadiyya wanted to introduce, Tasbih and Pirsho. The Soviet now use Russian terminology for them. Novobriatsy and Starobriatsy, new ritualist and old ritualist. Apparently the commissioner were trained, some of them in Moscow, and they borrow the church terminology. So in this debate you can see, I'm reading, Mirza Khandov is a Khalifa. He says that, you know, we should work according to the instruction of our Imam of the time, which he sent through Majālis Mu'ayyadiyya. Now Naimov, commissioner, communist, but he represents the old believers. He says the Khalifa is asking for prayer house because a representative from Moscow came for deputy for election, and the Khalifa says, I am, as a citizen, I have a right to ask for Jamaat Khana to be opened. The local authorities are paralyzed. Our Khalifa can ask these kind of things in the context of religion is disappearing. The Khalifa, the commissioner says, suppose you have a prayer house. If during the performance of Ismaili prayer of Pirsho, a Sunni Muslim enters the prayer house, how would you react to it? The Khalifa says, since our Ismaili teachings and prayers are regarded as a secret from the Sunnis, sorry, a mistake, we will request him to leave our prayer room. We would not allow him to enter. Then commissioner replies, has anyone from local authorities ever interfered during your performance of funeral rites for the deceased or other rituals and customs? The Khalifa says, no, no one has ever interfered. Naimov, you are demanding that 17 farmers should be provided a separate plot for collective resource. So this is, again, the Khalifa asks something else. Why do you think that collective farm and local government do not care about improving living conditions of farmers? Mirza Khandov says, as a Khalifa, I suggest and engage with religious matters among the believers. To raise the issue of constructing Jamaat Khana is that I have a certificate of registration. As a Khalifa, this gives me the right to take the care of the believers and citizens. As a member of the collective farm, I'm attending this meeting and spoke about the ways of improving the living conditions of the farmers. And the right and freedom of speech are granted to me by the Constitution of USSR. So what happens to this Khalifa? In my interview with his daughters and subsequently with the villagers, apparently the local government considers him mad and they torture him. And there are other Khalifas who were progressive. They found commonality between Soviet Islam and communism. One of the interesting figures, which is in my dissertation, is Sayyid Khosraw. He studied in Leningrad, in Oriental Institute. He became a Soviet secretary. And in 1960s, he denounced all of this and he becomes a Khalifa. And when I interviewed it, why the Obkom party, the Communist Party, did not inform Moscow about him, my colleagues or former commissioner told me that they were afraid if Moscow finds out that a very high-educated Soviet intellectuals or intelligentsia becomes a Khalifa, that's it, all the people will be reshuffled or fired from their job. So what he wrote, I need to make one note. In the Soviet Union, many Muslims were allowed to study abroad. They had their religious education center in Bukhara, Madrasa, and the Islamic Institute. This Khalifa wants the same. He wants that we should have an office, we should have connection, and we should connect to the Imam. Very radical, very radical. He says that we should be used in Soviet international mission to promote socialism abroad, like the Sunnis. Look at this, this is, and then these are basically the archives. So to conclude, well, the Khalifa never got reply, despite the fact that he said that communism and socialism, and he wrote a letter to the name of, I will show it to you, to the name of Khrushchev and Sultan Muhammad Shah, Maulana Sultan Muhammad Shah, and not the current Imam. To conclude, the documents from the Office of the Commissioners at first glance reveal the degree of regulation and control of religious activity, but with the Soviet accent, or the compliance of believers with the legislation and the decrees of decision of Communist Party. A critical reading of the archival documents against the information of oral interviews, however, reveals a different trajectory of adaptation, adjustment, and appropriation of the central Soviet religious policy by local officials and by the Khalifas. In the process of institutionalization of religious activities, i.e. the appointment of Khalifas, religious figures or Khalifas did not remain the passive recipient of Soviet message of socialism and development or struggle with religion. At times, the Khalifas and mullahs, they dovetailed the messages. They were saying that, I will interpret it, they were saying this from the archive, Soviet Union is Raiyat Parwar. It is a justice state. And these are mentioned in the teaching of Nasir Khosraw in our text and text of the Imam and Farmans of Imam. So look at the smart way they play. The data they play, the data on religion station that's presented in the archives were not always based on the interviews with the Khalifas, mullahs, or other religious figures. The commissioner did so, but these data were also filtered through different channels before sending to Moscow. Future study on the Muslim community in particular, I aim to study the same archives on the 12 Shi'is in Bukhara, which I almost did during my PhD. I collected lots of data on them and compare them with the Ismailis, whether the policy differ. Future studies on Gorno Badakhshan or any other localities should bring new light of the details of rich encounters between Khalifas and communists and define who were communist, who were believer in Muslim context of Central Asia. Another aspect of my study is historical study on biography of works of Khalifas. There are thick writing by Khalifas, papers, how many nikah I performed, how many charaw rawshan, how many money I have paid. I am sure it is of interest for the scholars in future. It will reveal their life within their secular and atheist context. It will also reveal their aspirations to be connected to the Imam, but more than that, their preservation and maintenance of religious tradition and practices. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aksakolov. I want to take advantage of my privilege of being the chair of this panel to take a few minutes and to say a couple of words about the Ismaili text and translation series published by the Institute. I know that Dr. Daftari, who is the general editor of the series, already mentioned it in his welcoming speech. And I'm sure that some of you are certainly familiar with this series, and several participants in this conference actually contributed to the series. So the general aims of the Ismaili text and translation series is to promote the knowledge and study of Ismaili intellectual heritage, and of course to make Ismaili texts available through the high-quality critical editions and scholarly translations to the scholarly community, to the Ismaili community, and to the broader readership. The series is unique in several aspects. First, because of its focus on the field of Ismaili texts, which is obvious. Second, because we work in close collaboration with the Ismaili special collections, so the rich collection of Ismaili manuscripts, which is preserved at the Institute. And the advantage of that is that we can provide to our authors, often we can provide help with actually helping them to get access to the manuscripts and providing them with the copies. And also one of the goals is to increase, of course, the visibility of the collections, manuscripts collections at the Institute, and their availability to the scholarly research. It is true that the previous publications in the series were mainly focused on the Fatimid period, Fatimid authors, and it is true that it is understandable that Fatimid period is extremely important in Ismaili history. But looking forward, we consider diversifying probably the scope of the Ismaili texts represented in the publications of the series, expanding it also to other periods and to other branches, to other Ismaili traditions. We are permanently working also on consolidating the documentation and processes of the series. So you probably know that the series are peer-reviewed, so we are permanently working to increase the quality of the scholarly control of the publications in this series, the editions as well as translations. Yes, so I just wanted to say that we are very interested in broadening the network of scholars who want to collaborate to the series, and also so to collaborate either by contributing the books, the critical editions of the text or translations, or by participating in our pool of the peer reviewers to help us to review the books. And this is very important because critical editions and translations of medieval texts, medieval manuscripts, require a very specific set of skills, including relevant linguistic skills, expert knowledge of the subject, and experience of working with the manuscripts. So it is extremely important for us to identify and to establish collaborations with people who can usefully contribute to the series. So to conclude, I just wanted to attract the attention of the attendees one time more to the Ismaili text and translations collection, and to invite the scholars present here to consider contributing to this series or spread the information about the series among your colleagues and maybe PhD students who could be interested to contribute. Thank you so much. So I stop here with my introduction to the series, and we have some time for questions.